Given what's happened since 2016, it might seem like Brexit is a very complicated issue, but at its heart it's not. To see how Britain got itself into such a bind, join me for a brief explainer. In January 1973, the British joined what would later be called the European Union, and at the time had the name of European Communities. The project, a complex arrangement that had as the main goal the banding of countries into an ever closer union, while at the same time attempting to maintain the political sovereignty of its members, was out of necessity full of contradictions. And given the UK's historical distrust of the continent, memories of World War II heroics, the legacy of a global and imperial history, and an overwhelming Eurosceptic popular press, made the British particularly skeptical of the project, even while there was a referendum in 1975 on whether or not the UK should join. This skepticism led to the UK being able to have special considerations within the European Union. It kept its own currency, it maintained control over its borders, as it never joined the Schengen Agreement, which got rid of border checks in the rest of the European Union. It also had a special arrangement on the Charter of the Fundamental Rights of the European Union, where European courts would be limited in how far they could rule on British issues, along with some other flexible opt-outs in the area of freedom, security, and justice. It was a sweet, sweet deal. Still, Euroscepticism remained, especially because to some the EU was essentially an anti-British plot, and most importantly because joining the Union had meant an increase in migration, particularly from Eastern Europeans, and this resulted in increased xenophobia and anti-immigrant views. Seeing an opportunity to gain power, one of the minor political parties in the country, UKIP, or United Kingdom Independence Party, began mobilizing entirely around the issue, promising that Brexit would be the quickest way to solve whatever problems the British had. As UKIP began to gain traction, David Cameron, the Prime Minister at the time, had the not-so-brilliant idea to promise an in-out Brexit referendum if he won the 2015 election. The idea was to cover his right flank within his own party, while simultaneously deflating any competition from UKIP. After all, what would be the point of continuing to compete on an issue that the majority of voters had already rejected? And Cameron had very good reason to believe voters would reject it. Polls were favorable, and again, the UK already had a pretty great deal. Its benefits were obvious, or so it seemed to Cameron and most of the British elite. So what could go wrong? What the Prime Minister was not counting on was a largely populist, emotive, and evidence-free campaign that promised British people things that could not possibly come about, such as extra funding for the National Health Service. Most importantly, many thought they were voting for something they were not, such as lower levels of migration. It was just enough to eke out a 52 to 48 decision to leave the European Union. Problem was that the referendum did not ask voters on what terms the United Kingdom should leave the EU, and because of the misleading debate surrounding the issue, voters had the expectation that they would basically keep all the things they liked, access to the continent's economy and subsidies, without anything they didn't like, Brussels regulations and migration from the continent. But of course, it was not so simple. The first problem for the British government was that the EU could not allow a non-member to have a better deal than those inside the Union. The second issue was that of Northern Ireland, the only place where Brexit would create a physical border giving Ireland's membership in the European Union. Obviously, given the history of the Troubles, creating any kind of physical checks would be politically unpalatable, since it might surface some of the underlying Catholic grievances in the country. It might even be in violation of the Good Friday Agreement that ended the violence of the 1970s and 1980s. It would also be economically questionable, as any type of barrier would hurt spending on both sides. Theresa May tried to solve the problem by creating something called the Irish backstop. This consisted in requiring Northern Ireland to maintain some aspects of the single market until an alternative arrangement were agreed between the EU and UK. In addition, the whole of the United Kingdom would retain a customs union arrangement with the EU. That is, the UK would be forced to keep the tariffs the European Union had towards any third country until an arrangement could be found where no customs controls would be needed between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. This would presumably involve some type of technology, But should no other agreement be found between the EU and the UK, this would remain indefinitely. If this sounds like a proposal with the softest of Brexits, where very little economic change would occur, you're right. And that's precisely how it was interpreted by the Parliament, which promptly turned it down, but tied itself into knots trying to come up with an alternative. In the end, they fudged. May was removed, and the new Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, which had severely criticized the backstop, basically agreed to another almost identical arrangement. The difference was that this time Northern Ireland would officially leave the European Union on paper, but not in practice, and the customs checks would be moved to the Irish Sea. The deal is not popular in Northern Ireland, and it might yet create other problems. And still, even after all that, the UK and the EU remain without a deal with just a few days to go. Why? The answer is that basically the United Kingdom is trying to exert its independence with an arrangement that is not designed to do so. Free trade deals are supposed to be about managing interdependence. Those who support Brexit insist that whatever short-term pain might result will be worth it. But in the end, it looks like the UK will end up with the worst of possible worlds. Thousands of British citizens who enjoyed freedom of movement in the continent will no longer be able to, and the UK itself will have to abide by all the EU regulations without having any say in them.